In the dusty town of Deadwood Creek, nestled between the rolling hills of Dakota Territory in 1882, the morning sun cast long shadows across the railroad tracks that cut through the heart of civilization like a silver scar. The whistle of the 8:15 westbound had become as familiar as breathing to the townsfolk. But none knew it better than a small figure who appeared at the platform every single day without fail. Thomas McKinnon, barely 12 years old, with clothes that hung loose on his thin frame and eyes that held stories far beyond his years, stood at the same spot where the passenger car doors would swing open. His weathered boots, too big for his feet, had worn a permanent mark in the wooden planks below. For 3 years now, ever since the influenza outbreak claimed his parents and left him with nothing but hope and determination, Thomas had waited by those tracks with a tin can in his small hands and a question that would change everything. What the townspeople of Deadwood Creek didn't know was that Thomas wasn't just another orphan begging for coins. He was searching for something far more precious than money, something that would lead him down a path filled with secrets buried deeper than the gold mines that once made this territory famous. The boy had a plan, one that would unfold on this particular morning when the westbound train would bring more than just passengers to their sleepy town. The locomotive's steam hissed as it came to a grinding halt, metal wheels screeching against the rails in a symphony that had become Thomas's daily alarm clock. Passengers began to emerge from the cars, their fine clothes and polished shoes marking them as city folk passing through to California or Oregon territory. Thomas positioned himself near the steps of the first passenger car, his practiced routine beginning as naturally as sunrise. He removed his worn cap, smoothed down his unruly brown hair, and cleared his throat to speak the words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times before. But today would be different. Today, as the doors swung open, a vision in white silk and French lace descended the train steps like something from a fairy tale. The bride was radiant, her golden hair pinned up beneath a delicate veil that caught the morning light, and her dress sparkled with tiny pearls that must have cost more than most folks in Deadwood Creek saw in a year. She moved with grace that seemed almost otherworldly, her gloved hands lifting the hem of her magnificent gown to avoid the dust that swirled around the platform. Behind her followed a tall gentleman in a black suit and string tie, his silver hair and distinguished bearing marking him as a man of considerable means and influence. Thomas had seen many travelers over the years, but something about this couple struck him as different. There was tension in their posture, a careful distance between them that suggested this was no ordinary honeymoon journey. The woman's eyes, though beautiful, held a sadness that reminded Thomas of his own reflection in the creek when he thought about his lost family. As the other passengers dispersed toward the town's single hotel or continued their journey west, the bride remained on the platform, her gaze wandering across the simple buildings and dusty streets of Deadwood Creek as if searching for something or someone. Her companion, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with the station master, their voices low and urgent. Thomas watched from his usual spot, clutching his tin can but hesitating to approach. There was something about these strangers that made him forget his rehearsed speech about needing money for food and lodging. Instead, he found himself studying the woman's face, noting the way she kept glancing back toward the train, as if considering whether to board it again and continue her journey away from whatever awaited her in this remote corner of Dakota Territory. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant wood smoke as Thomas finally mustered the courage to approach the elegant couple. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden platform as he drew closer, his tin can forgotten in his nervous grip. The bride had moved away from her companion and now stood alone near the edge of the platform, her white dress creating a stark contrast against the weathered wood and rusted iron of the train station. Thomas had spoken to hundreds of strangers over the years, but something about this moment felt different, more significant than his usual requests for spare change. As he opened his mouth to speak, the woman turned toward him, and their eyes met for the first time. What Thomas saw in her gaze wasn't the usual mixture of pity and dismissal he'd grown accustomed to from well-dressed travelers. Instead, he saw recognition, as if she had been expecting him, waiting for this exact moment. Her lips parted slightly, and for a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross, while the sounds of the departing train and bustling town seemed to fade into the background. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. His voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Ma'am," he said, the words coming out different than he'd planned, more personal than his usual practiced plea. "Can you take me home?" The question hung between them like a prayer, simple yet loaded with meaning that even Thomas didn't fully understand. The bride's eyes widened, and she took a small step back, her gloved hand moving to her throat in a gesture that suggested surprise or perhaps fear. The question seemed to affect her in a way that Thomas couldn't comprehend, as if his words had unlocked something she'd kept carefully hidden. Her companion, the distinguished gentleman in black, had finished his conversation with the station master and was now approaching them, his keen eyes taking in the scene with obvious concern. But the bride held up one delicate hand to stop him, her attention remaining fixed on the small orphan boy who had somehow managed to ask the one question she'd been dreading to hear. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the platform. But time seemed suspended in that moment of connection between the elegantly dressed woman and the lonely child who had been waiting by the tracks for far longer than anyone realized. Years of surviving on the streets had taught Thomas to read people quickly and accurately, a skill that had kept him alive when hunger and cold threatened to claim him like they had so many other orphans in the territory. But this woman was different from anyone he'd encountered before, her reactions unpredictable and her emotions playing across her face like clouds moving across the sky. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an accent that Thomas couldn't place, something refined and Eastern that marked her as being from far beyond the frontier towns and settlements he knew. "What did you say, child?" she asked, though Thomas was certain she had heard him clearly the first time. There was a tremor in her voice that hadn't been there before, and her hands, despite their elegant gloves, were trembling slightly. Behind her, the gentleman in black had stopped approaching but remained close enough to intervene if necessary. His weathered features set in lines of concern and something else that Thomas couldn't quite identify. The boy repeated his question, this time with more certainty, sensing that these words held power he was only beginning to understand. "Can you take me home, ma'am? I've been waiting here a long time, and I think maybe you're the one I've been waiting for." The bride's reaction was immediate and unexpected. She sank down onto a nearby wooden crate that served as makeshift seating for waiting passengers, her elaborate dress pooling around her like spilled milk against the rough wood. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and she pressed one gloved hand against her chest as if trying to steady her heartbeat. The gentleman rushed forward then, his polished boots clicking against the platform boards as he knelt beside her, his voice urgent but low enough that Thomas couldn't make out the words. Other passengers and townspeople began to take notice of the commotion, their curious glances and whispered conversations adding to the tension that seemed to crackle in the air around them. Thomas stood frozen, uncertain whether he should retreat or move closer, his tin can still clutched in his hands but forgotten in light of the drama unfolding before him. He had asked his simple question expecting either a kind refusal or perhaps a few coins thrown his way, but instead he had apparently triggered something far more significant and mysterious than he could have imagined. The woman's eyes, when she finally looked up at him again, were bright with unshed tears that caught the morning light like diamonds. What happened next would be talked about in Deadwood Creek for years to come, though the various accounts would differ in their details as stories tend to do when passed from person to person. The bride stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, despite the obvious emotional turmoil she was experiencing. She approached Thomas with careful steps, her silk skirts whispering against the wooden platform, and then did something that shocked everyone present, including the boy himself. She knelt down in her pristine white dress, heedless of the dust and dirt, and placed her gloved hands gently on Thomas's thin shoulders. Up close, he could see that her eyes were the color of summer grass, and that despite her obvious distress, there was kindness in her expression that reminded him of his mother's face in his fading memories. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft and musical despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Thomas told her his name, adding that he'd been living on his own since his parents died in the influenza outbreak 3 winters past. He explained about waiting by the tracks, hoping to find someone who might need a boy to help with chores or farm work, someone who might give him a place to belong again. As Thomas spoke, The bride listened with an intensity that made him feel important, as if his words mattered in a way they never had before. Her companion stood nearby, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment, occasionally glancing toward the town as if expecting someone or something to appear. The station master had retreated to his office, but Thomas could see him watching through the window, his face reflecting the curiosity that seemed to grip everyone who witnessed this unusual interaction. When Thomas finished his simple story, the bride was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face as if memorizing every detail. Then she spoke words that would change both their lives forever, though neither fully understood the implications at the time. "My name is Elizabeth Thornfield," she said, her voice steadier now but still carrying that undertone of deep emotion. "And yes, Thomas McKinnon, I think I can take you home. But first, I need to tell you something important, something that might be difficult to understand." She glanced back at her companion, who gave her a slight nod of encouragement, before continuing. "The home I'm talking about isn't just any home, and the family waiting there isn't just any family. If you come with me, your life will change in ways you can't imagine, and there will be no going back to this life you've known by the railroad tracks." The mysterious nature of Elizabeth's words sent a shiver through Thomas that had nothing to do with the morning chill still lingering in the air. There was something in her tone that suggested secrets and hidden truths, the kind of adult mysteries that children often sensed but rarely understood. The gentleman in black stepped forward then, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Elizabeth," he said, the single word loaded with warning and concern. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making any hasty decisions that could complicate an already delicate situation." But Elizabeth shook her head, her green eyes never leaving Thomas's face, as if she were trying to see into his very soul. "No, Charles," she replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Some things are meant to be, and some meetings are too important to be dismissed as coincidence. This boy asked me if I could take him home, and I believe the answer is yes. But Thomas needs to understand what that truly means before he decides whether to come with us." She paused, looking around the platform at the curious faces watching their every move, before continuing in a lower voice that only Thomas and Charles could hear clearly. "You see, Thomas," Elizabeth continued, her words careful and measured, "the home I'm going to isn't an ordinary place, and the people there have been waiting for someone exactly like you for a very long time. There are things about your family, about who you really are, that you don't know yet. Things that were kept secret to protect you, but secrets that can't stay hidden forever." Thomas felt his world tilting slightly, like the ground beneath his feet had shifted in some fundamental way. In all his years of dreaming about finding a family, about belonging somewhere, he had never imagined anything like this. His parents had been simple folks, his father a railroad worker and his mother a seamstress, and they had lived quietly in their small cabin on the outskirts of town until the sickness claimed them. What secrets could there possibly be about people who had lived such ordinary lives? But as he looked into Elizabeth's earnest face, he saw truth there, or at least the promise of truth, even if it came wrapped in mystery and uncertainty. Charles, meanwhile, was checking his pocket watch with obvious agitation, his eyes scanning the horizon as if watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. The sound of horses approaching at full gallop suddenly echoed across the platform, causing heads to turn toward the main street where a cloud of dust was rising in the distance. Charles immediately stepped protectively closer to Elizabeth, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat where Thomas noticed the subtle bulge that suggested a concealed weapon. Elizabeth's face grew pale beneath her carefully applied cosmetics, and she gripped Thomas's shoulders more tightly, as if anchoring herself to his presence. "We need to leave now," Charles said urgently, his genteel demeanor replaced by the sharp alertness of a man accustomed to danger. But Elizabeth hesitated, her eyes moving between the approaching riders and the boy who stood before her like a bridge between her mysterious past and an uncertain future. "Thomas," she said quickly, her voice urgent but still gentle, "I know this is confusing and frightening, but I need you to trust me. Those men coming toward us aren't friends, and they're not here by accident. If you want to learn the truth about who you are, about the family you belong to, then you need to come with us right now. But if you choose to stay here, To continue your life as it has been, I'll understand, and no one will blame you for that choice. The riders were close enough now that Thomas could make out individual figures through the dust. Men in dark clothes riding hard and fast with the kind of purpose that suggested trouble. The townspeople who had been watching the drama on the platform began to disperse, sensing danger with the instinct of frontier dwellers who had learned to recognize threats quickly. The station master emerged from his office carrying a rifle, his face grim as he took position behind a support post. Charles had produced an elegant silver pistol from beneath his coat, checking the cylinder with practiced efficiency before turning to Elizabeth with obvious frustration. "We cannot delay any longer," he said firmly. "The boy will have to make his choice now, or we'll have to leave him behind for his own safety." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at Thomas, who stood in the center of this swirling chaos trying to process decisions that seemed too large for any child to make. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by shouts that carried clearly across the morning air. Voices calling Elizabeth's name with a familiarity that suggested these were not random travelers, but people who knew exactly who they were seeking. In that crucial moment, with danger approaching and time running out, Thomas McKinnon made a decision that would echo through the years to come. Without fully understanding why, driven by an instinct deeper than logic or fear, he reached out and took Elizabeth's gloved hand in his own small, calloused one. "I'll come with you," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I've been waiting by these tracks for 3 years for someone to take me home, and I think you're that someone, even if I don't understand why yet." Elizabeth's face transformed with relief and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if Thomas had just confirmed something she had hoped but not dared believe. Charles wasted no time in taking action, grabbing Elizabeth's traveling bag with one hand while keeping his pistol ready with the other. "There's a buckboard waiting behind the grain elevator," he told them quickly. "We can reach it through the back alley if we move now." The three of them hurried across the platform, Elizabeth's silk dress hindering her movement but her determination overriding any concern for propriety or appearance. As they reached the edge of the platform and prepared to descend into the alley that would lead them to their escape route, the first of the pursuing riders rounded the corner of the main street. Thomas caught a glimpse of hard faces and drawn weapons before Charles pushed him behind a stack of freight crates, Elizabeth following close behind. The rider in the lead was a tall man with silver hair and a black hat, his clothes marking him as someone of means and authority, but his expression was cold and determined in a way that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Elizabeth Thornfield," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. "You cannot run from your obligations forever. Come out peacefully, and the boy won't be harmed." Charles cursed under his breath, a word that Thomas had heard plenty of times around the railroad yards, but never from someone so refined. Elizabeth's face had gone white as fresh snow, and her hands were trembling as she peered around the crates toward their pursuers. "He found us faster than I expected," she whispered to Charles. "How could he have known we would be here, in this particular place?" The answer came from an unexpected source as the station master's voice rang out across the platform, addressing the mounted men with obvious familiarity. "She's behind the freight crates, Mr. Blackwood," the man called out, and Thomas felt his stomach drop as he realized they had been betrayed by someone he had trusted, someone who had watched him wait by these tracks for years without ever showing such callousness. Elizabeth closed her eyes as if in pain, while Charles's grip on his pistol tightened. 30 pieces of silver," Charles muttered, his cultured voice thick with disgust. "There's always someone willing to sell their soul for the right price." The sound of boots on wooden planks told them that the riders had dismounted and were approaching on foot, their spurs jingling with each step like some deadly music. Elizabeth turned to Thomas then, her green eyes intense and urgent. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, speaking quickly but clearly. "No matter what happens next, remember this. Your real name isn't Thomas McKinnon. Your parents weren't who you thought they were, and the life you've been living here was never supposed to be permanent. You are Thomas Whitmore, and you are the heir to one of the largest cattle ranches in Montana Territory." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow, leaving him dizzy and confused as the world, he thought he knew crumbled around him. Before he could ask any of the 1,000 questions flooding his mind, the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Charles made a desperate decision. He stood up from behind the crates, his pistol trained on the approaching men, buying Elizabeth and Thomas precious seconds to escape. "Go!" he hissed at them. "Take the boy and get to the ranch. Tell them Charles Morrison kept his word." Elizabeth grabbed Thomas's hand and pulled him toward the back of the platform, where a narrow ladder led down to the alley below. As they climbed down, Thomas could hear Charles speaking to their pursuers, his voice calm and controlled despite the danger. "Gentlemen," Charles was saying, "I'm afraid you've made a long journey for nothing. Mrs. Thornfield has already departed on the westbound train, and she won't be returning to Dakota Territory anytime soon." The lie was bold and convincing, delivered with such authority that Thomas almost believed it himself. They reached the bottom of the ladder and found themselves in a narrow alley that smelled of horses and hay, with wooden buildings rising on either side like canyon walls. Elizabeth's white dress was already showing signs of their desperate escape, dust and grime marking the pristine silk, but she paid no attention to her appearance as she led Thomas toward the back of the grain elevator where a buckboard wagon waited in the shadows. The horse harnessed to the wagon was a strong-looking bay gelding that stood quietly despite the commotion happening on the platform above them. Elizabeth helped Thomas climb into the wagon bed before gathering her skirts and climbing onto the driver's seat with surprising agility for someone wearing such an elaborate dress. Above them, they could hear voices raised in anger and what sounded like a scuffle, followed by a single gunshot that echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder. Elizabeth flinched at the sound but kept her attention focused on untying the reins and preparing the horse for what Thomas sensed would be a hard ride ahead. As Elizabeth guided the buckboard out of the alley and onto a dusty side street that led away from the center of town, Thomas caught one last glimpse of the train platform where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. Through the gaps between buildings, he could see men in dark clothes searching among the freight crates and arguing with each other in voices too distant to understand clearly. Of Charles Morrison, the gentleman who had sacrificed himself to give them time to escape, there was no sign, and Thomas felt a hollow sensation in his chest as he realized that this brave man had paid a price for helping them that might have been the ultimate one. Elizabeth seemed to sense his thoughts because she reached back and squeezed his shoulder gently. "Charles knew what he was doing," she said, though her own voice was thick with emotion. "He's been protecting your family for longer than you've been alive, and he wouldn't want his sacrifice to be in vain. The best way we can honor him is by getting you safely to where you belong." The buckboard rolled through the outskirts of Deadwood Creek as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, leaving behind the only home Thomas had ever known and heading toward a destiny he was only beginning to understand. Elizabeth drove with skill and determination, her earlier delicate appearance replaced by the competence of someone accustomed to handling both horses and crisis situations. As they reached the open prairie beyond the town limits, she urged the bay gelding into a faster pace, the wagon wheels kicking up dust that would make them harder to track from a distance. Thomas clung to the sides of the wagon bed and watched his familiar world shrink behind them, the railroad tracks and platform where he had spent 3 years of his life becoming just a distant memory. But instead of sadness, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents died. Hope. Not just the vague hope of finding someone to care for him, but the specific, powerful hope that came from learning he had a real family, a real home, and a real identity that had been waiting for him all along. As they traveled across the rolling grassland of Dakota Territory, Elizabeth began to tell Thomas the story that would reshape everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. His parents, she explained, had not been simple railroad workers as he had always believed, but rather trusted employees of the Whitmore Ranch who had been given the most important job of their lives, protecting the young heir to one of the most powerful families in the Montana Territory. When Thomas was just 7 years old, she continued, there had been a range war between the Whitmore family and a rival outfit led by the same Mr. Blackwood, who had just tried to capture them at the train station. The conflict had turned deadly, with hired guns and night riders making life dangerous for anyone connected to either side. Thomas's real parents, James and Catherine Whitmore, had made the heartbreaking decision to send their only son away to safety, entrusting him to their most loyal friends with instructions to keep him hidden until the danger passed, and it was safe for him to return home. But the danger had lasted longer than anyone expected. Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying the weight of years of worry and planning. The influenza outbreak that claimed Thomas's adoptive parents had been a terrible stroke of bad luck, leaving him alone and unprotected at exactly the wrong time. For 3 years, she and others had been searching for him, following false leads and dead ends while Thomas waited by those railroad tracks, not knowing that people were looking for him, not knowing that he was the key to ending a conflict that had torn apart 2 of the most powerful families in the territory. Elizabeth herself, Thomas learned, was not just a random traveler who had happened to stop in Deadwood Creek, but rather his older sister, who had been away at finishing school in Boston when the Range War began and had only recently returned to help resolve the family crisis. The white dress she wore was not a wedding gown as Thomas had assumed, but rather a disguise designed to help her travel without attracting the attention of Blackwood's men, who had been watching all the regular stagecoach and railroad routes for any sign of Whitmore family members. The revelation that Elizabeth was his sister hit Thomas even harder than learning his real name and heritage, because it meant that he was not alone in the world after all, that there was someone who shared his blood and his history and who had risked everything to find him. As the buckboard rolled across the endless grassland toward Montana Territory, Elizabeth told him about their real parents, about the ranch that would one day be his, about the cowboys and ranch hands who had worked for the Whitmore family for generations and who were waiting for his return. She told him about the schools he would attend, the responsibilities he would inherit, and the life of privilege and purpose that awaited him. But she also warned him about the dangers that still lay ahead, about Mr. Blackwood and his determination to destroy the Whitmore family and claim their land and water rights for himself, about the hired guns and political corruption that had made the Range War possible, and about the difficult choices that Thomas would have to make as he grew into his role as the heir to a cattle empire. As the day wore on and they traveled deeper into the wilderness between territories, Thomas began to understand that his sister's rescue had come not a moment too soon. The men pursuing them were not just random troublemakers, but part of a larger conspiracy that had been years in the making, a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate the Whitmore family and seize control of their vast holdings. Mr. Blackwood, Elizabeth explained, had been systematically buying up smaller ranches and water rights throughout the region, using both legal and illegal means to consolidate power and eliminate competition. The Whitmore Ranch, with its prime grazing land and crucial water sources, represented the final piece of his empire, but as long as Thomas lived and could claim his inheritance, Blackwood's plans remained incomplete. This was why the search for Thomas had been so urgent, and why his discovery by Blackwood's men would have meant not just his own death, but the end of everything his real parents had built and died to protect. The afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly as they reached a crossroads where 3 different trails diverged across the prairie, each leading toward distant mountain ranges that shimmered in the heat like mirages. Elizabeth pulled the buckboard to a halt and studied the landscape carefully, her expression troubled as she scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. Behind them, a dust cloud was visible in the distance, growing steadily larger and suggesting that their escape from Deadwood Creek had not gone unnoticed for as long as they had hoped. "We have to make a choice," Elizabeth told Thomas, her voice tense with the urgency of their situation. "The direct route to the ranch is faster, but it's also more open and leaves us exposed if Blackwood's men are tracking us. The mountain trail is longer and more dangerous, but it offers better cover and several places where we could lose our pursuers if necessary." Thomas, who had spent years learning to read the moods and intentions of travelers at the railroad platform, could see that his sister was genuinely frightened, though she was trying hard to hide it from him. The decision was made for them when the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the prairie, followed by the unmistakable thunder of horses being ridden hard in their direction. Elizabeth whipped the reins and sent the bay gelding charging toward the mountain trail without further hesitation, the buckboard bouncing and swaying over the rough ground as they raced toward the tree line that promised concealment from their pursuers. Thomas held on tightly and watched behind them as the dust cloud grew larger and began to resolve into individual riders, at least 6 men mounted on fast horses and gaining ground with each passing minute. The mountain trail, when they reached it, proved to be little more than a deer path winding up through dense stands of pine and aspen, barely wide enough for their wagon and steep enough to force the horse into a labored climb that slowed their pace considerably. But Elizabeth seemed to know where she was going, guiding them along switchbacks and through narrow passes with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route before. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the pursuing riders fell further behind, their horses struggling with the altitude and the treacherous footing that made speed impossible. But Thomas could see that their own horse was tiring too, foam flecking its sides and its breathing becoming labored as they pushed higher into the thin mountain air. Elizabeth was watching the animal carefully, her experienced eye noting every sign of fatigue, and Thomas realized that she was weighing their options with the calculation of someone who understood that pushing too hard could leave them stranded and helpless. When they reached a small clearing beside a mountain stream, she finally called a halt, allowing the horse to drink and rest while they tried to decide their next move. The sound of pursuit had faded, but both of them knew that their enemies had not given up, merely fallen back to regroup and plan a different approach. It was while they rested beside the mountain stream that Elizabeth told Thomas the most shocking part of his story, the piece of the puzzle that explained why Mr. Blackwood was so determined to capture or kill him, and why the range war had lasted so many years without resolution. Thomas's real father, James Whitmore, had not died in the range war as Thomas had been told, but was still alive, though gravely injured and unable to actively manage the ranch or defend his family's interests. The story of his parents' death had been a necessary lie, designed to protect Thomas from the knowledge that would have made him even more determined to return home before it was safe. James Whitmore was being held prisoner on his own ranch, a captive of the very man who was supposed to be negotiating a peace settlement, while Blackwood's men controlled the property and gradually transferred ownership through forged documents and legal manipulation. The only thing preventing Blackwood from completing his takeover was the existence of Thomas, the rightful heir whose return would expose the fraud and restore legitimate ownership of the ranch. This revelation filled Thomas with a mixture of joy and rage that was almost overwhelming, the knowledge that his father was alive competing with anger at the years of deception and the ongoing injustice being perpetrated against his family. Elizabeth watched him struggle with these emotions, understanding exactly what he was feeling, because she had experienced the same conflicting feelings when she first learned the truth. "I know it's hard to understand why we kept this from you," she said gently, "but you were just a child, and there was nothing you could have done except get yourself killed trying to help. Now that you're older, now that you've survived on your own and proven that you have the strength and intelligence to handle difficult situations, it's time for you to know everything and to help us save our father and reclaim our family's legacy." The mountain stream bubbled peacefully beside them, its clear water reflecting the afternoon sunlight, but Thomas barely noticed the beauty of their surroundings as he grappled with the magnitude of what lay ahead. The sound of approaching horses brought them back to the immediate danger of their situation, and Elizabeth quickly led the bay gelding to drink one last time before they resumed their desperate journey toward safety. The mountain trail ahead wound through increasingly rugged terrain, with steep drops on one side and towering rock faces on the other, terrain that would be treacherous for both pursuers and pursued. But Elizabeth seemed confident in their route, explaining to Thomas that there was a hidden valley ahead where they would find allies, men who had worked for their father and who had been waiting years for this moment when the rightful heir would return to claim his birthright. These were not ordinary cowboys, she warned him, but hardened men who had been fighting a guerrilla war against Blackwood's forces, striking from hidden bases and melting back into the wilderness before retaliation could reach them. They were led by a man named Jake Brennan, their father's former foreman, who had refused Blackwood's offers of employment and had instead organized the resistance that had prevented the complete takeover of Whitmore Holdings. As they negotiated a particularly narrow section of the trail, with barely inches to spare between the wagon wheels and a precipitous drop into a rocky canyon, Thomas caught sight of their pursuers far below, tiny figures on horseback picking their way carefully along the same route. The distance gave him hope, but Elizabeth's continued urgency suggested that. Subscribe to the channel to receive the second part of the story.